Good evening. Welcome to the Council Committee work session, Thursday, October 12th. Council President Goodman will be a few minutes late, so I'll open this up before she gets here tonight. First item of business is call to order. Second agenda item is ID 0138, proposed 2018 budget, first budget work session. And we'll start with the overview of the mayor's proposed budget, programs, and services.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Tonight is the start of the discussions for the 2018 proposed budget. It is budget development season, so welcome. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the overall budget, give you some framework about the budget document, and then I think the important things is getting to some of the presentations by the administration that will help in giving you some background information about the proposed budget. And so I'm just going to kick it off here with the 2018 proposed budget was based on parameters that had been identified by Mayor Butler. This may be something new as we start to transition into budgeting for outcomes and results-based performance management, performance metrics, all of those kind of big lofty terms. But what we identified, or the mayor identified for the administration to propose budgets that were based on these parameters. And those included financial stability, sustainability, stability too, that comes with it, maintaining community safety, focus on quality over quantity, post-moratorium action plans, developing our staff, investment in technology, finding new or expanding our sources, often referred to as revenues, maintaining our existing assets and levels of service, and limiting the number of new staff proposed. Just a little bit about the framework of the budget. Again, the department budget requests are in, for the most part, there's some summary when it has to do with a fund, so you can see the fund in its entirety, revenue versus expenditure in the various pages of the budget. There is a more level of information about a parameter if it's applicable in a department, because I wanted to remind everyone that department budgets are also based on that department or division's routine annual workload, and that means daily, weekly, monthly tasks that each department handles. And oftentimes in the department mission in the budget, you can find what it is that department does. And so if there wasn't something that was significant in a method, a way to achieve the parameters, then know that that department was still vital and critical to the overall operations. And so it's just important. I just wanted to note that as we go through, because you're going to hear presentations not department by department, but by parameter. And so you're going to hear from a variety of departments tonight that is pertaining to community safety, and that's on the agenda. So with a budget, what's keenly important to be part of the budget document is the financial management policy. Earlier this year, the council went through a process for updating financial management policy. It's the financial guide to the administration. It identifies key targets, benchmarks, identifies guidance, objectives that as we work through budget processes, as we work through work plans, anything that has to do with financial, there's a guide to that. And then, of course, there's supplemental procedures, but those are administrative in nature. So what I wanted to do was, as we start with a new updated financial policy, what you'll start to see in this budget as well as in future budget, and this is where we talk about performance management or metrics, is does this budget help to or work towards to achieve policy that's set forth by the council? And so what I wanted to just overview quickly about financial policy and why we do that, and why the council went through that exercise, is that it sets forth those financial principles that we want to be achieving. We have goals to reduce economic and environmental risk, maintain the financial capacity for defined levels of service, and that can be existing services, proposed new services, or maybe perhaps what we would stop providing as a service. Financial policy is there to ensure for legal compliance, and of course to guide and instill that we are here to provide financial transparency in all that we do. So just a little key on a couple of these points that I want to make about the policy is that if we're in compliance with the policy, there's a check mark. If there's a dash, then that means it's a work in progress. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a negative, but wanting to let the council know that these are things that as we continue to develop good financial performance metrics, things that the council is looking to see, just wanted to let you know that that's a constant ongoing process for the administration. So one of the key policy benchmarks in the financial policy is that the budget is adopted at the fund level. And so the budget document is prepared in summary form, and there's tons of detail behind the numbers that go into that. But at the council level, you adopt at the fund level, but in the budget it provides some breakouts of some major categories, and those being salaries and benefits, supplies, services. In this particular budget, we wanted to make sure that it was clear about transfers in and out, because one fund transfers to another fund, and that fund is the transactional fund that tracks a project or tracks a special program. So you can see that. But adopted at the fund level. The reserve level for the general fund is a major target in the financial policy. And this is what was changed from a range of 8 to 15% in our ending fund balance for the unknowns that come up. So that fund balance target in the general fund was changed from 15 to 20%. So that was all part of, as we developed the budget, we wanted to make sure that we had complied with that new range, but also there's other parameters in the financial policy that we wanted to achieve, and that was a balanced budget. So you can see we have a blue check mark because the proposed budget identifies that our ending fund balance would be around 34%. Another reserve level for major operating funds are our business funds, our enterprise funds, or often known as the water, sewer, stormwater funds. So it's important to note that there are in the financial policy that there's some fiscal indicators that help us say these funds are healthy to a certain extent. So there's other things besides rate setting and what we do with regards to capital projects. But one of the things is that how we can measure the health of that fund is through the capital funding obligations. Are we setting aside enough reserves for future capital outlay? Do we have enough in operating reserves? And that is set at a 90-day level. And do we have enough to cover our debt service? And sometimes in the private sector, you hear that this is like debt service ratio or coverage ratio or things of that nature. So what we're obligated to do is ensure that we have reserves at 125% of our reserves to document or verify that we can cover our debt. So the reason that I put this at a work in progress status is that these are new fiscal indicators, so we're putting together the tools to analyze this. So what I can tell you is that in the utility funds, we meet our operating reserve. We have certainly cover our debt service coverage because we're obligated to do that. And so the next step is that we're working on ensuring that our capital funding obligations, that we have a good strategy going forward for ensuring that reserves cover. And that'll be something that we'll have in future conversations on either financial policy or when we're talking about the performance in the utility funds. Another policy benchmark that is key is that the budget is balanced. And in 2018, the mayor's proposed budget, this was a parameter that was basically number one, is that we would bring forward a budget that had a general fund structurally balanced, or essentially that current expenditures were not more than current revenues, and that is the case with the proposed 2018 budget. So that is in the blue check mark column, that expenditures are less than revenues. And so you'll see in the budget, and a very important sheet in the budget is the summary revenues, expenditures, and impact on fund balance. That's a place that we'll use as, when we talk about at the fund level, how that is impacting fund balance. And one of the things that I wanted to mention about the budget this year is that, number one, the general fund is proposed to not impact fund balance, actually see an increase in fund balance. And last year, as you recall, there was the proposal for there to be an impact in fund balance or use of resources in order to accommodate for the spending. What you see this year is that we've had some new funds, and those are special revenue funds. There's we closed the capital project fund, and so what you're going to see is, for example, the new REIT fund. What that was set up to do was to accumulate all of the REIT into one fund. So we could be transparent about what we're receiving, because REIT sources are primarily used for capital projects. And so you'll see in that fund a lot of transfers out, because the nature of special revenue funds and the nature of capital project funds and debt service funds or non-operating funds is to spend the dollars on a specific program, or in the case of a capital project fund, you're going to, essentially if you were just looking at one project in the fund, you'd want to spend all those dollars on that capital project. So just wanted to make that point about when you see the use of in some of those non-general fund or non-operating funds, is that those are proposed to have a use of ending fund balance. And so you'll see a lot of parentheses or negative numbers. Another key policy benchmark in the financial management policy was cost allocation. This is something that is in the work in progress, the blue dash. One of the things that's also new this year is the new internal service fund for IT. This is an internal type service. It's similar to the fleet fund. And so what happened is that this fund was set up so that IT services are provided to other benefiting funds and other, so for example, you'll see in some of the line items in the general fund departments where you'll see operating going up. That is because what we went through is a major effort to pull out all of the expenses that had been tracked in various departments and various funds or IT, perhaps classified in supplies, some classified in equipment, some classified as professional services. We wanted to be more transparent and actually ensure that the benefiting departments and funds were actually paying the right amount for information technology and those services. So the cost allocation plan was a new section in the financial policy. We are going to be going through an effort in 2018 to continue to update our cost allocation methods. And so what that will mean is that we'll be going through and coming up with a method of how to, for example, financial services. How do we ensure, by what methods, and we'll come up with those, that we charge those benefiting other funds and departments. And so this is a work in progress, but IT is a good example for us to get our feet wet in ensuring that we have complied with cost allocation, because that really is driven by state law as well. The budget includes a 5-year model, and this is a new tool that will be with all budgets and should be part of the discussion when you're talking about the proposed budget and the future, how does it perform? And so we want to look a little bit longer term than the 1 year. Now, another reminder is that we're going to be going to a biennial operating budget cycle, which is kind of exciting, and we will be starting that for 2019 because we have to start it in an odd year. And so the model then identifies how the next 5 years look. And when we talked about this at the council retreat, this is where you saw the new model, and it's based on, we can create multiple scenarios, but it's based on assumptions. The model that's identified in the budget includes the current debt obligations that are transferred from the general fund into the debt fund. And so that's in this particular baseline. It also includes all of the 2018 proposed budget. And so you'll see that in there's some columns in the model, and it's color-coded, so you can actually see 2017, an estimated forecast of how we interpret the year will end financially, and then there's a 2018, and then going forward the next 5 years, it identifies what we anticipate for growth in property taxes, and it identifies future sales tax, B&O taxes, all of the major revenue sources, and then it has expenditures that are essentially based on some very basic assumptions for new staffing. 2018 includes the new staff that have been proposed in the budget, and so that is in there. It's not a separate line, but I just wanted to point that out, that we may refer back to the model in some of our presentations about the budget overall. Does this make us worse off or better off? And an additional reminder about the fact that it's 5 years. And sometimes when there's a plan to spend down reserves, because that's kind of a key line item in the financial model to see how does that impact us, always remember that there's another 5 years, or there's 10 years. And so when we talk about future plans and when we talk about what we could do over the course of those next 5 years, then we want to get that into a scenario in a financial model so that you could see how does that make us look better or worse. Also in the budget is new financial indicators. And this is another way to start measuring how we are doing financially. And so the 2018 budget is included in the projected. There's some historical information about revenue per capita, expenditure per capita, operating deficits, capital outlay, and property values. These are just some of the indicators that we've started to develop. There's plenty more that will be pulling that together. And so I just wanted to give you an overview about how the 2018 budget looks, and then of course the financial model flows into the indicators to say, are we doing okay? Does this look on a long-term basis look like something, a plan, a fiscal plan that you can be confident in? So from a revenue per capita standpoint, you'll see that 18 plus the future years keeps us kind of level with regards to revenue per capita. Now there are, and you'll find in the budget, some notations with regards to what does it mean. And so I encourage you to read that. I'm not going to read that in detail here, but I want to encourage you to read that because that helps you understand why am I looking at this information. So if revenues are, obviously revenues, you want to see them going up, but a decline isn't necessarily problematic if there's a plan to accommodate for declining revenues for some reason. Yes, Tola?
So if revenue per capita is level and expenditures per capita is increasing, how can operating deficits be stable?
Well, because operating deficits, we look at that in terms of the financial policy reserve target. So the reason that I put stable there is because they're not dipping into or they're not going below the floor that you've set for your general fund reserve.
Okay, but they're not stable over time. They're not a problem yet, but they can't be stable. They've got to be heading towards that threshold. They're just not crossing it for
Correct.
a while?
That's correct. And that's where I mentioned there's a 5-year financial model, but there's also to keep in mind, there's 5 years, after that, and 5 years after that. And so what you do now, or over a 5-year period, impacts longer term. And so that's part of our transition into giving you this information so that when you're making decisions, you see the long-term impact versus just 1 or 2 year budget cycles.
So are the expenditures per capita over time increasing at a rate greater than the historical increase in the CPI?
Yes, that's what I'm seeing.
Okay, that concerns me.
Okay.
Because that was my criteria last year, to sort of say that over the long haul, our finances were in good shape,
Yes.
because in real dollars, they were not increasing per capita once you corrected for CPI. Right? So if you're telling me that's going to change going forward, then I'll want to understand that better as we go forward through this process, because that's kind of a trigger for me.
And in the indicators, the CPI is a factor in there, so so we use it to measure off of, and so that is it's a neat tool for you to look and get a quick snapshot of the good or the negative. So we'll continue to talk about that for sure.
Okay, thank you.
There's other indicators there for operating deficits. The capital outlay that from a replacement level, what we've done is that is the capital budget, and just to kind of just give a brief overview about the capital budget. I'll do that in a little bit, but this reflects, if you look at that indicator, the capital outlay that is proposed in the 5-year, multi-year capital CIP, capital improvement plan. And then, of course, there's some information about property values, and those are certainly rising. So the 2018 revenues, all funds, the proposed budget is $129.5 million. This pie chart identifies that the major component of all of those funds that we collect, and this is all funds, so this is utilities and this is general fund and all of those different types of funds that we have. 32% of all of our revenues come from charges for services, and so I just want to point out that is driven by charges for services. In this instance would mean utilities, so that's where we're charging rates. The second largest part of the pie is in taxes, and so you'll see overall, we're diversified quite nicely, actually. When we look at the general fund, then you can see, because most of the taxes come into the general fund, so you're going to see a different pie for that different fund. But essentially, we've got about $17 million that go from transfers in and out of funds. We have identified about 6% of our overall fund resources come from cost allocation, and those are also might be considered transfers out, but they're actually considered charges, from one service to another, or one fund to another, and so that's oftentimes a confusing thing, but it is similar to a transfer. And then, of course, we've got intergovernmental or shared, so that is grant dollars, that is dollars that we get from other agencies. Overall expenditures are at $137 million. And you'd say, well, you just told me that we had a balanced budget. This is all funds. We have in the general fund, and that's where I'll bring you back to the summary revenue, expenditures, and impact on fund balance. Overall, we are utilizing essentially the cash on hand, the resources on hand for things like capital projects, for special programs that are in special revenue funds, and we're also paying down debt. And if we're not adding more, then obviously we're going to be utilizing the money that's in those debt funds. So the largest piece of on the spending side is for general operating. That is at 29% of overall expenditures. Salaries and benefits come in at about 27% of the overall fund allocations that are proposed. And then we have 22% of all spending is attributable to capital projects and investments in our capital assets. This is a quick chart to give you a perspective of how the fund balances are being impacted. So you can see that the blue is the estimated beginning fund balance for the fund types, and the green is the estimated ending fund balance. So general fund is estimated to, at the end of the year, we're estimating that the general fund would be higher than what we started at for 18. Special revenue funds are forecasted to be reduced because we're going to, we have programs and special things to spend dollars on. Debt service fund is pretty even. We're kind of in the middle of some of our payment schedules. So what we take in for debt service funds, that's transferred from the general fund. But then on the voted debt fund, you'll see that that comes from the excess levy property taxes. Capital projects, certainly, that's always a type of fund where we are going to be using those resources. And you might ask, why is it negative? This is one of those types of funds that it's all about cash flow, because this is a one-year budget, but we have multiple years, and this has to do with a lot of, at the time when we show the council fund balance, always remember that it's a snapshot and it is constantly changing. Every time we write a check and every time we take in a deposit, fund balance is impacted. So activities affect fund balance. So it's one of those things that snapshot in time, we want to show you exactly what we're seeing now, but there are receivables that we have taken in. And so we'll continue through the budget processes to give you an update on our estimated beginning fund balances for 2018 so that you can see the estimated ending fund balance and how we interpret how we'll fare financially. Enterprise funds are identified to utilize cash for, in large part, some capital projects that have been identified. Internal service funds, this is the fleet fund and the new internal service fund for IT. And then, of course, we've got one trust and agency fund, and that is expected to be relatively at the same beginning and ending fund balance.
So Jennifer, you and I had talked about this information this afternoon, and I wondered if there was a similar slide that we would be able to see at some future meeting that shows us what this looked like for our 2017 budget. I had asked you, is there a shift this year from last year? We started off with a $2 million drawdown in the general fund, but the other funds seemed not to have the same kind of impacts they do this year. So is it possible to get something to look back and see how, are we doing something different this year, I guess is the question.
We're going to be providing that. And one of the things in the budget, there's a page that says the comparison from prior years is coming. We wanted to ensure that we've got the comparative data on what we spent dollars on actually and actually took in revenues, that we needed a little bit more time because of the timing of the publication of the budget. We were not ready with ensuring that we had 3 years of history in the same format because we've got new funds, we deleted some funds, so we wanted to make sure that we had a good report for you to get that comparative level of detail. The general fund, this is our major operating fund. As I pointed out, the lion's share of the resources that come in for the general fund are taxes, and that is at almost 69%. That comes from property taxes, sales taxes, B&O taxes, and there we'll have some future work session, and then of course there's a public hearing with regards to the proposed revenues that do include property taxes, and for the 2018 budget, it does include the 1% increase in according to state law for our limitations on increasing property taxes. The other large source in the general fund is charges for goods and services. This is where you'll see the non-license and permit fees that come in under development services. This is the park and recreation category for programming fees. And then, of course, we've got some variety of smaller resources coming from fines and forfeitures. Intergovernmental, that is grant dollars, and other revenues. There's miscellaneous, so things like interest income and a variety of things that are just small revenue sources. On the expenditure side, we have got the largest portion of the general fund budget because we're a service provider. That is salaries and benefits, and so that is about 50% of the budget. With operating expenditures coming in at 34%, and professional services and transfers out are pretty similar, and those are at 7% and 8% of the budget. This is some historical as well as how we interpret 2018 ending fund balance. You can see that over the course of the last 5-6 years that the general fund balance was at over $11 million. That has continued to grow. And in 2018, we are estimating that we would be at approximately 17.2, almost $17.3 million. There is the gold and the green lines. The gold line is, according to financial management policy, that's the maximum amount in that range of 20%. So you can see that we'll be well above that, and we have been well above the target for general fund reserves. And the green line is the minimum, and that is 15%. And so you can see those dollar amounts that we would require to be kept in reserves. The CIP this was a new process. So when we talk about the capital component or the capital budget, the council went through earlier this year a new process for identifying the 5-year capital improvement plan and investment in capital assets. This is the same summary that is in that separate final capital budget that is available and should be linked to your budget if you're looking at it electronically. But the capital budget was identified, and in this table here, it shows by the category of asset. And the important number to take a look at will be the 2018 number, because that number is in the 2018 budget that you have. One thing that I want to point out, and we'll be going into that if they're project specific when we're talking about that, is that 2018 has over $28 million in capital investments, and that is included in the 2018 budget. So this is essentially the spending authorization to as we've progressed through identifying those projects. Now this is where the funding comes into place in order to carry out those projects. This list, I could read it, but I'm not going to, is a list of the actual projects that are intended to be accomplished in 2008. Some will be started, some may be finished because they are, for example, Southeast 62nd Street, that has been ongoing. But you can also see that there are some of these projects, there's a comparison of the plan that it had been appeared in previously, so you can see the 2014-19 CIP as well as the 17-21. The X means that it was identified in that plan. The dash means that it was not in a plan. So, for example, the public safety radio coverage was identified in the 17-21 plan, and it's also in the 18 plan.
Can you actually back up one slide? So one of the things that's interesting here is look at the ratio of the 5-year total spend to future years. right? So, I get that for some of them, like transportation, you're looking at 5 years out of 20 or 5 years out of 30. But some of these are seriously look unbalanced to me. If we have $7,700,000 worth of trails work, and we only accomplish 137,000 of it in the first 5 years, that does not look like the right fraction of that overall load. And there's a couple like that. Municipal facilities, and I realize that can potentially have large lump sum things going on, but there's a couple of these that don't look, most of these look fine, but there's a couple that do concern me, and that trails one, I would like to come back later to understand why we're doing such a minuscule amount of the overall identified trails work in that first 5 years.
Okay, and so we'll note down that opportunity for that, and I also then wanted to, is to make sure that what is exciting is that in the new capital budget process, which is also a biennial now budget, and so what we're looking at is that we had 2018 through 22, the 5-year capital plan, and so that off year is where we get to start adding in that public engagement effort and start taking the plan as well to the community and asking for feedback on that, so that when we go back into the capital budget development cycle, updating, adding, eliminating, however you want to term it, is that we'll have been able to go through that new cycle of public engagement that that was important to add into the whole process. So just some brief points as I'll end my overview is that the budget presentations will be based on the parameters, and again, that was kind of a new structure this year, so you can see what we're trying to achieve. What we've identified in the budget schedule is that at the end of each work session that has been identified in the schedule currently is that the administration would take questions, and so we want to make sure that we're getting all of council questions. We have a tracking tool that we are ready to take council questions, and we want to make sure that if there is a question that may be similar on a similar topic, so the administration wants to be able to efficiently respond, and so what we'll be doing is we'll be collecting that information, and then at one time we want to bring back that information to you. But one of the things that you'll see is that you'll see the questions as they're asked. So we're going to be adding that into our work session, the documents or materials, so that you can see that those questions, we have those questions, and that the administration is working on answering those. If it's not if we don't have the ability to quickly answer it, if it requires more detail, but just wanted to make that known is that we're gearing up to try to have an efficient way that we can get you answers to the information that you're looking for. The other thing I just wanted to note is that when we go into council deliberations, is that we also have a tool perhaps similar to what has been used in the past, but we want to make sure that any changes that the council is, that individual council members are offering up or advocating for or agreeing on, is that so that you're seeing that immediate impact of what that would do. If you want to add something, you want to delete something, so that's something that we're ready to track and provide for you. And then I just wanted to just point out that the next budget work session will be October 30th. So that's all that I have, and I am really happy to shift gears and get you into our next item on the agenda, which is presentations on maintaining community safety.
Thanks, Jen. I think what I'll do now is see if there are any council members who have process questions on what you presented tonight, especially in terms of how you want the questions and all the rest of it. Anybody have any questions for Jen, or any, is it clear how you're supposed to submit your questions and how we're going to get answers, or do you need more information? Oh, did you have something?
Or I guess just on submitting them before, like other ones that you'd set a sheet up of some sort, or, I mean, we could just do an email to you, or how you want to do that. That'd be the only technical question I'd have.
Yeah. So if you ask questions here, we're going to record those. We'll perhaps ask for clarification to ensure that, is that a question that you indeed want to be posed as a question, want more detail on. Also, that if you do provide an email question, we'll log all questions, because we want to make sure that even though whatever format they come in, we want to make sure that likely there could be similar questions, just posed different ways, but then we can respond in a real comprehensive manner, and then provide those responses on a routine basis.
Thanks, Jen. So questions tonight or by email is fine. Anybody else have any questions on process? Okay.
Not on process.
Oh, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, Jen, I just want to thank you for that presentation. It was an excellent introduction. Thank you.
Thanks.
Let's move into the next item on the agenda, department presentations on budget parameters, and it looks like we're dealing with community safety on tonight's agenda. We'll hear from police services, fire services, emergency management services, and the last item will be ADA improvements.
Hi, good evening. I'm Emily Moon, Deputy City Administrator. And just before the chief comes up to start us off on community safety, I wanted to just summarize what you're going to hear, in that it's not a department overview. We're not bringing up every department to tell you how they are maintaining community safety next year. Every department could make a pitch for their role in that endeavor, but we're not doing that. We are focusing on giving you some information on highlights of the budget. So what's new and different, what are enhancements that we want to call attention to, or where are we having some increased costs or increased demands for service. So that's the theme. You're not getting A to Z what a department does to maintain community safety. You're just getting budget highlights on some specific topics that the department's identified as being a little new or different. That's going to be the theme as we talk about each of the budget parameters. No department overviews, but if there's information that you would like to know that's outside of what gets presented for a particular department or service area, just let us know. All right, with that, here's Scott.
Go past this. These are the different aspects you're going to hear tonight, but we'll go on to the police department. In the 2018 budget, the requests we have are for 3 police officer FTEs, 1 police communication supervisor, and increase a current position, an administrative support assistant, from 0.5 to 0.75 FTE. We'll get a little bit more into the intent, but overall, we look at utilizing 2 of those police officer FTEs towards traffic and 1 towards general services, police. Part of the parameters of maintaining community safety, I want to give you some of the outcomes, and we'll hit on these again later. The intent of the increased FTEs is just really to kind of maintain that level of service. With the rising calls for service that we've seen over the last 5 years, and anticipation of the ending this year at an again increase of over 5% of calls for service, the addition of the staff would help maintain our current level that we're providing our community. The intent is also to hopefully increase the proactive enforcement opportunities by building the capacity, and really importantly, as discussed briefly on Monday at another council work session, is talking about how do we address the lag time of hiring from the time of authorization of position to actually getting a functional police officer out on the street and having be able to be effective within our community. Additionally, for our PSAP, our 911, our dispatch center, again, this is adding the FTE as will assist with building that capacity and addressing the continued increase of calls for service. And I'll give you some data and show that here shortly as well. In addition, our past structure of our police department utilized our patrol supervisors who are working the street to also help provide supervision for our dispatch center and with our jail. but with the increase of calls for service on the street, that's impacting their ability to spend more time to be able to help them with that supervision as well. Additionally, a lot of demands on increase of the regional collaboration from all the discussions about PSAP, efficiencies, King County discussions about how escrow or 911 escrow monies are spent as well, are impacted by our staffing. For the administrative support assistant, with the addition of the Munis financial software, we're trying to create some efficiencies of utilizing our administrative assistant for helping us out with operations on the financial pieces. Additionally, we're seeing a lot of increase for training and management and certification, overtime management, and as well as our accreditation standards. So building the capacity in this aspect will help free up some of our other staff to focus on their law enforcement pieces. We've talked a little bit before about our call volumes. This is a snapshot of a 3-month period, kind of demonstrating when our call volume is. Although we're a 24-hour service, the majority of our call volume is coming in from kind of the hours of 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. And we see about 70% of our calls for service overall are happening, well, the majority of them are happening from about 7 a.m. till about midnight. So having to deal with our staffing and demands for service from everything from calls for service, 911 responses, and additionally traffic, the interest in additional traffic enforcement, we're having to continuously balance our workforce. Additionally, about 35% of our calls for service require multiple officer response. So, like for example, in 2016, we had about 15,057 calls for service, but actual responses were close to 22,600. So it's just not just an individual call for service. A lot of them require multiple officers to respond. So a lot of our workload, as you see, it's not just one officer responding to one call. Sometimes we're having to send multiple, and therefore we're having to spread around our resources and move them around. This is a conversation, we'll review it to talk about like a 10-year horizon about where our calls for service were and where they're at today. And then also the impact as calls for service are increasing that reduces the amount of proactive time for our staff. Now, looking back at 2007, again, this is kind of a refresher for some of you, but back in 2007, we had reevaluated our calls for service and how we were tracking our data. And over the next few years, we were evaluating and moving how we were tracking our calls for service. We realized that there might have been some multiple recordings of data, and we stopped recording, and we moved to how we were recorded some of our data. We also implemented a false alarm ordinance in 2009, which then had a pretty drastic, 2008, to have a pretty drastic impact on reduction of calls for service. We had about 1,000 calls less just from the false alarm ordinance. So that was a very effective impact to our calls for service. By about 2011, we had reached a stable point of where we haven't made changes for how we're doing our reporting, and that's also coincides when we implemented our new crime tracking, our NIBRS crime statistics module. So we really didn't change anything after that. So what you've seen from 2011 to present is a steady growth, and which coincides with our growth of our community as well. One of the conversations that we've had about calls for service per officer, what that's based on is that means how many calls that individual officer is responsible for, and really the documentation, writing reports, taking care of, being the one in charge of that call. The blue line shows what we've been experiencing, and the orange line is what's showing of if we were fully up to speed. We've had conversations about over the last several years how we've never really been up to full staff, either through vacancies. And what I mean by vacancies is everything from having a true vacancy in that position, or having someone who's injured, who's not able to actually fulfill the duties of a police officer, or somebody who's in training that isn't ready to be on their own. So we've averaged over the last about 3 years about 3 to 4 vacancies per year. Prior to that, we were averaging about 2.5 vacancies per year. So what you're seeing here with the orange line is if we were up and running full staff, you're still seeing the increase of calls for service. And I know I'm kind of going through this, but some of this data, but really what we're talking about is increasing capacity to maintain that level of service. What we're seeing on the trend, we're anticipating some more continued growth within our city, and to be able to respond to our calls for service and associated or demands for the growth of the community. We're anticipating the increase of patrol capacity would help create time for preventative, data-driven policing and directed patrol, and hopefully get that shift back towards a proactive workforce. And by allowing you that, then of course would hopefully increase our capacity to then have more directed or prioritize a little bit more traffic enforcement as well. So this is really to kind of to lay it out is with our calls for service growing and our capacity level, we have to make decisions by not growing the capacity. We can maintain our current level of service, and it's going to push up more towards the green if with more capacity, or if we have less calls for service, or if it starts pushing further down and we have to make other decisions as our demands for service continue to grow. Some of the efficiencies through lean process, we've been working on those. This year we're bringing online more of some modules within our own records management system for more statistical analysis. We're also going to be utilizing, hopefully by the end of 2018 as well, we should be bringing on another module that addresses some of our crime reporting in our NIBRS crime reports that will add some efficiencies to our officers by the end of 2018. We've added some other modules that helped speed up some of the capturing of data, but it's not transferring quite yet over into a large efficiency. Additionally, we talk about we've talked about like the use of other personnel for selected functions. Currently our department has an investigative division, but we don't necessarily have a crime analyst, but that would help with that data management piece as well, and could be integrated with the budget performance module that is in our CIP as well. So integrating and collecting, collating that data could be helpful as well. But as we go into 2018, and as we look at some of those, sorry, do you have a question? Come back. Okay. As we go into 2018, we want to continue to look at that, because as we are able to bring online some of our new modules, we're going to have a better evaluation of what kind of efficiencies we will be able to have. So hopefully by the end of 2018, we'll have a pretty good idea on that as well.
Do you want to wait till the end or now?
I want to ask about this slide,
Sure.
Scott. I want to make sure I understand what you're communicating with this slide. So I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to repeat some of what
Sure.
you said. So when I look at it, the green up, prioritization of traffic enforcement, I look at red down, triage all. So, but what are the dimensions we're dealing with here? Are you talking about the number of, the size of the staff, or changing priorities? Help me.
Sure.
I don't know what these dimensions are.
Sure. So maintaining current level of service. So some of the slides.
That's one in the middle. That's a third one down.
Right.
Maintain.
So just to maintain, we are assuming that we're going to have an increase of calls for service, meaning we're going to have an increased demand for service within our community as years move on. Right. So next year, by the end of this year, we're expecting to see at least a 5% growth in demands for calls for service from last year to this year. That equates to approximately 700-800 calls for service.
Okay.
Oh.
There.
So it's not real clear down on the bottom, but 2016 is about blue currently, about 851 calls for service per officer. If we were fully staffed, that meant about 752. So just with a 5% increase, we'd be looking at the needs for potentially another officer to help take on that additional workload, just at 5%. So each, if it goes up an additional 5%, that's what we're talking about, just to maintain the level of service. Additional above that, to get ahead of that curve, that's when we'd be talking about increased patrol capacity for preventive and directed patrol. So I'll explain, I guess, another way. I think I maybe explained this before. As like in a pie, correct? We only have so much time that we can apply in that pie. And if it's taken up by more calls for service, that means we're using it less for additional preventive patrol, like traffic or for other human services or some of those other pieces. Is that?
So your plan in the 2018 budget is aiming for what?
Well, currently,
level there?
maintaining current level of
Just
service.
maintaining.
Yeah, that's under the mayor's parameters. It would be looking at maintaining level of service, current level of service. That's what we're shooting for under the mayor's parameters. And the other one we talked about at the beginning is the increase of FTE will help with that offset, as we kind of talked about where we would reset to that orange line from the blue line, which was the current calls for service. The orange line was originally the if we were fully staffed of how many officers or how many calls for service per officer. This is just kind of a reminder of that lag time. From the time we're authorized to hire somebody to the time they actually are up and on their own is about 12, 13 months. We have to recruit, do a background investigation on somebody, bring them on board. Then we have a little bit of a wait time, about 2 months to wait until we get them into the basic academy. We can start instructing them and training them, but we need to send them to the basic academy, which is a 5-month period. They come back, then they have about another 3 months of field training before they're released on their own. So it's a little bit of a lag time. So that's part of this.
No, go ahead. I'll ask when you're done.
Okay.
You're done with this?
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
yeah.
So in your answer to Paul's question about maintaining the level of service, so we have had some vacancies over the last 3 or 4 years, and filling those vacancies and then adding 3 more officers gets us just to the maintenance level?
Yes. That's what we're shooting at, because the 3, assuming past historical of and we'll call them again, remind the vacancies is either in process of training or potentially injured or actual vacancies. One of the issues that we run into is anticipating replacements. Retirements. Sometimes people announce a retirement, a year in advance, which is great. Sometimes we have somebody who gives us 30 days notice that they're retiring, or they have a change in their family situation and they are going to be leaving us. So if we have a short period of time, that's what that lag time, that's what this is. What we're looking at is by the addition of the 3, we'll play the catch up of if we were fully staffed, we'd basically be resetting to about 800 calls for service, which were below the actuals of 2016, anticipating, again, another 5% rise.
I just wanted to add, too, there's the other additional dimension on this is just growth. So,
Yeah.
With Gateway coming on board and all the other housing units that have been added in the community, just by virtue of the additional people moving into town, if we keep our staffing level, there's going to be a decline in services because we'll expect more calls just by virtue of the fact that we got more people living here. So part of the addition is just to manage the fact that we've got pretty significant amount of growth in terms of new units that have been built in the community.
Great. It's just, I think the piece that's hard to understand is how many officers are on a shift right now?
So tonight, for example,
Yeah.
we have 6. That's if fully staffed.
Great. And so adding 6 more to the existing staffing and only being able to maintain, that's hard to understand. It almost seems like if you add 6 and our population is growing, we actually should be moving the needle down towards being able to do some proactive traffic enforcement.
Well, it's a combination of anticipated growth in 2018, right? So 2017, we're on track for a 5% increase of calls for service, just in 2017 alone, with no additional staffing. So that's additional officers worth of calls for service. 2018, which we'd be looking at, I'm anticipating, if we keep on the same trend, another 5% or maybe 4%, we'd still be adding another officer's worth of calls for service. So that's 2 officers worth of calls for service. The 3 that we're finally getting on board, the ones that you're talking about, the ones that we're finally would be getting on board, is getting us up to that point, getting us caught up to those last 2 years, or 17 and 18.
Yeah, it seems that adding 5 bodies to get us back to the 2016 level, not doing more proactive enforcement, doesn't seem bad.
Yeah.
But you know what? we'll probably dive into this later, it's fine.
Okay, I did want to just say, so so there's always going to be that, so we're really adding 3 new, and then those 3 that have been open, there will always be a level of vacancy, even though those positions are authorized full-time. I mean, there's just kind of a consistent level of openings that will occur. So I know we'll get people injured, we'll get people that will be sick, we'll get people that will retire. And so, and I think you had a slide on that, but over time what happens is you almost have to count on like 2 bodies being kind of vacant as a result of just natural occurrences that occur over a work year for those positions. And then you run into that slide there of it takes 13 months to get a new body pretty much hired unless we get a lateral. So the challenge is that flip, that 3-person, those 3 that we have open that are always, if you can get that down to 1, that's great. But generally over time, you look at the number of hours that you end up losing just due to those things happening. We've tended to be around 2.
Yeah,
And
historically leading up to about 2014, we were probably always at about 2 vacancies, and then now we've gotten about to 3.
Okay. Sure, Mariah, Bill?
So I was just wondering if there had been, I'm not familiar with the process for the job posting to hire or the academy wait time, but I'm wondering if there's been any work around that to try to shorten the 13 months. So you've got 2.5 months for job posting to hire. Maybe you have a really significant, I would assume, interview process and background checking and that kind of thing that goes into that. But has there been any discussion of that to try to shorten things a little bit?
Yeah. So we've actually worked with Civil Service and the Human Resources Department to kind of have a continuous list available. But then, selecting those people, when the opportunity comes to hire somebody, it's a very active market, so to speak, with police officers. And so you might get somebody on your list, and within 2-3 weeks, or if you have not acted on them, they could be hired by another organization. They could be. And we also go through quite a few people that maybe make through a certain testing process, but then they fail. There's quite a bit of failures in our background process as well, because they go through a polygraph, an extensive background, a psychological, and a medical testing. And getting through all of those to then fit into our organization, that does take a while, but we have a pretty significant amount of failure. We have a pretty significant amount of failure that don't even make it through the initial interview process as well. So there is a lot of work continuously going on with that. There's been a lot of work also within legislation to make sure that the academy classes are funded at a good rate, and there's actually been some success in that in these last couple of years. So we've seen within the last year an increase. If you had asked me this about a year ago, that Red academy wait time was about 4 months, almost to 5. So we've reduced that down a little bit. There is an opportunity, I guess, we could continuously put somebody into that testing process and hope that there is like the right vacancy. But, this year alone, so right now we have 3 individuals who are in the basic academy right now. One will be coming out of the academy in December, and the others will be coming out in 2018. And those are, so there's 3 positions right there that are still not, they're hired, but they're not functional yet. But there has been some work on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so of the 3 positions you're talking about, one officer and 2 traffic officers.
Yeah.
So with the emphasis on desire here from the traffic side, my concern is if you're saying maintain level of service, but we're adding 2 traffic officers, but you're saying we're going to, as happening with our current traffic officer, getting pulled away.
Yeah.
Where if we're going to focus on, say, we're going to have some dedicated traffic officers, then I want to know we're going to have dedicated traffic officers, not keep getting pulled away for other stuff, because if we're just maintaining our level, which you're saying we're not able to really respond to all the call for services because our current level is not doing the job we want, and I'm not sure if that answers, it gets us to where we want if you're saying, because I want something different.
Right.
than maintaining our current level of service, particularly in the traffic arena. And if hiring 3 more won't get us anything different, I'm a little confused because we're saying 2 are in traffic particularly.
Yeah.
So I want to say that's a true statement, not an officer that could be pulled somewhere else.
Okay, yes, I hear that. And we are constantly having to move our resources around as we've had to these last couple of years from everything because of injuries and retirements and vacancies or just emergencies. Just if we do have a traffic officer, just a couple weeks ago, we had an incident that required pretty much the whole department to respond, and it took about 8 hours to resolve. And it was a burglary call, and it was an occupied burglary. So one call can immediately turn our resources upside down. So it's based on life safety. So our calls for service, we're always triaging them and our demands for service. So yes, if we're going to respond to those. So I do hear what you're saying, and I hear that statement.
Yeah, I just want to say, so it's not 100% dedicated to traffic in terms of total hours, but what we'll see is we're going to be able to see a higher chunk of those hours be dedicated to traffic, because if there's a call for service, you had that one slide up there, they have to go. So life safety issues are the first and foremost thing. But by having additional bodies, what we are going to be able to do is just dedicate more of those total hours to traffic enforcement, which I think we've heard from the council is a priority.
Right, and that's what after there's then 3 traffic officers. I understand life safety is an emergency, but other kinds of things that you have to fight those sometimes to keep that traffic as a high priority if that's what you want to do, and I think a lot of folks here do.
Mariah?
So I just wanted to make sure, I'm kind of going back to our presentation in safety and services, but so if the officer is not dedicated to traffic, they are working on other things, and they may have the capability, if they have time, to do a traffic stop.
Correct.
But these additional officers that are dedicated to traffic, they would be working predominantly on traffic, and then if obviously anything emergency-wise, that they would then respond to that.
Right.
But the rest of the time, they would be working on traffic.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to make sure I understand.
Correct. Yes, a traffic officer, their primary focus would be to focus on traffic. And I want to also be clear about this too. It's not just about writing tickets. So our traffic division does also do education pieces, but it also does partner, with engineering to kind of try and resolve issues. Like if there's a localized issue, they spend on traffic, which means that's all of that. So it is not just about writing tickets. There's other pieces to that too as well. But yes, that's typically their assignment.
Anything else on this slide?
Okay, we'll slide into the PSAP 911 workload. Again, similar. This is a graph of the last 6 years of our calls for service that we receive within our 911 center. Really, the big spike in 2014 was due to we also provide services for Snoqualmie and North Bend. We have a contract with them, and we evaluate that. But in 2014 is when North Bend came online, so we saw a spike of calls for service as well. As part of that, though, there is a contract with them to help address that, and we actually added FTE during that process.
So I was going to ask, so those revenue source, it actually covers the cost of the FTE that was added?
Yes, it did. And then we also have, again, yearly, we have yearly adjustments as well.
And they're a small percentage of the calls for service?
North Bend?
Yeah.
Yes.
And they are not, oh, that's okay.
Okay. So we actually saw, again, these are just all phone calls. So not just 911 calls, but we also, business lines. So again, 24-hour coverage. We have business line calls. In 2014, why you see the big drop from 2014 to 2015 is we actually implemented the phone tree. So before 2014, when you called our business line, you talked to a person right off the bat. And we actually implemented a phone tree to help direct our calls for service, because we receive a lot of calls also for our jail. Because of our 72-bed jail, we definitely got a lot of calls in there as well. So the phone tree helped create that efficiency as well, to direct the calls to the right location. We also, during the daytime, a lot of them would automatically get pushed to our records division, which is staffed kind of the normal business hours as well. And we also then went back to our partner agencies with Snoqualmie and North Bend and had them adjust how they manage their business lines as well. So for a while, some of their calls were coming into our dispatch center when they should be going, so we've made some adjustments and we've managed that. As a result, since 2015, 2016, we're seeing the rise back up again. And again, this is just pure volume. The increases do also coincide with our increases of calls for service. So you're seeing a lot of calls coming in and out. So besides the, this is just, I know this is just a 2-year window of this, but besides just answering the phone, our dispatch center also manages a lot of the access entries, so the computer database entries of like stolen vehicles, stolen property. They manage warrants in the middle of night as well, so when someone gets arrested for a warrant. So we're entering those in, missing people, impounded vehicles. So there's a lot of pieces that they're doing besides just answering the phones, and those are increasing. One of the issues, and I know one of the conversations we've had before is, could we move workload? But a lot of these issues is we have them because like stolen vehicles or missing people, we want to get them entered in right away. If we wait, so if a call comes in at 10 o'clock at night, we don't want to wait till 9 o'clock the next day to enter some of these in and have risk some of these issues. So looking at how we do this business, again, keeping this within the PSAP makes sense because again, the immediacy of some of these kinds of calls and making sure the data gets entered in right away. Really, the intended outcomes is just to increase our capacity to maintain our level of service and respond to calls. Our current dispatch, we have 1 dispatch supervisor currently and 10 dispatchers, and our dispatcher has been spending our dispatch supervisor has been spending a lot of time within the sitting in the chair answering the phones as well. So it hasn't had a chance to focus as much on some of the development and the quality assurance to making sure that the calls are being answered properly and handled properly. In addition, we haven't had as much time to connect with some of our regional partners on some of the PSAP issues. I think one of the pieces too, and I mentioned a little bit earlier, our past model was our patrol supervisor, patrol sergeant, was in charge, at night and on the weekends and had a chance to be the supervisor of the jail and the dispatch center, as well as what's going on the street. As the workload on the street gets busier, they have less time to spend in the jail to make sure that things are going well, and also within the dispatch center. By having a second supervisor, we can spread that workload out and have more supervision throughout our 24/7 operation. Any questions on the dispatcher?
Okay.
Okay. And then the last piece is the increasing the 0.5 admin assistant to 0.75. And really, as we've seen a lot more demands on certifications and training and monitoring all of the certifications, from everything from CPR, first aid, our DUI certification, et cetera. We also have a lot of annual tests for all of our personnel, from hearing, bloodborne pathogens, hazard awareness, things like that. And so management of that it's becoming more and more. It's better to place it in that position to help monitor that. Also with our Munis process as well, just again managing all of our invoices, requisitions, and purchase orders. It'll help with efficiency within our own department. And also with a lot of some of these construction projects and a lot of the growth, there's been a increased demand for overtime and like traffic control, things like that. Although we're not doing a lot of it, we still have to manage some of those projects as well, for overtime for police services, for flagging traffic, things like that, or community events. There's the billing as well that goes along with that. So really the important of that, in addition, is the accreditation program. So we do get accredited, and it's helping monitor and assure that we are up to standards for our policies, procedures, and all of our certifications.
Is that the end of your presentation?
That is.
Question, yeah?
So as I look at the staffing levels at the end, I see, you see, the IPD is moving away from, it looks like, from having a deputy police chief.
Correct.
To having a third commander. So how does that work? You assumably get to take a vacation occasionally? And who's in charge when you're gone?
Great question. No, when I first became chief, we did have a deputy chief. When he retired, we flattened the organization just a little bit by underfilling the deputy chief with that third commander. Really, we have like the three business lines of kind of our patrol operations, what you see on the street, our management of our jail, and then also the oversight of our PSAP 911 center. A lot of those positions also have a lot of cross training as well, and it's a really the commanders do rotate. If I do leave, then I do have one of three to help cover.
Gotcha. You got to have a quarterback, right? There has to be somebody. The buck has to stop with somebody.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Any other questions for Scott? Go ahead, Bill.
So as we've had difficulty filling positions, I understand in this general Puget Sound area, that's not unique to us. All police departments are having that position
Correct.
of finding good qualified people and getting new folks trained, right?
Correct.
And there's a lot of swapping back and forth and so forth. So at being at 3 to 4 down consistently for the last 4 years and trying to get those plus 3 more, what's the reality you could really get that many people in place reasonably, because we haven't been able to get them historically? It's a fight. How much could you really get those in place?
Right. Well, so we have hired, several this year. We have hired several, but the problem is they are in the process of being trained. So we are playing catch up. So that, again, that 3, the reality of it is we can probably hire somebody. I do believe that we would be able to fill those positions. Now, can I guarantee that one of my officers doesn't get hurt? A couple years ago, I had one of my officers riding his motorcycle in a corner, and a deer darted out in front of him, and he was had a broken leg, and he was on light duty for about 11 months. So he's back on duty now, and he's fully recovered. But those are those instances that I can't have. I've had some of my officers get injured in the line of duty, and they are out for a couple months with a surgery. And so those are things I can't anticipate. But the ones that when someone leaves, within like a 30-day window, those are the ones that are harder to play catch up. Historically, also kind of in the last few years, we've had to switch to entry level as well, because laterals, there's just not as many in the pipeline or is available in the pool, applicant pool. So switching from a lateral, because a lateral, we can cut off 5 months of training, right? So that we can get down to 6 months. But finding solid laterals is very, very difficult.
Anyone else? Scott, thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.
It looks like next we have Eastside Fire and Rescue Fire Services.
Are you on here next?
No, I don't need any PowerPoints.
Oh, okay, we'll do that there.
All right, thanks.
Welcome, Chief Clark.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I apologize, I don't have any slides, but I do have an overview, and I do, since we're not directly part of the city, I do want to just explain to you the process that we have been through for our budget. Actually, earlier tonight, we just had our budget approved. But we start in June every year, and we lay out in the things that I'll go over with you briefly here. Started being vetted in June with what we call the FAC, or the Finance and Administration Committee, which is made up of our 5 partners, which of course is you, Sammamish, North Bend, and Districts 10 and 38. So the elected officials that are appointed to the board, they sit on the FAC, and we have a monthly meeting along with any finance staff that does attend. And I know Jen was at several, if not all, of the FAC meetings. I believe you were at all of them, but I don't want to speak for sure. Most of them, all right. And then we follow that up with touches at the board level. And tonight we concluded that with the board approving the budget. So what was approved as far as the overview goes was overall, it was a 3.99% increase, all right? And that's to all partners, all right? So I don't have Issaquah specific in front of me right now, but the increase associated with the EFR increase was, first of all, the largest chunk, 3.64%. was due to the collective bargaining agreement that was signed back in 2015. There was nothing new added to the collective bargaining agreement. It was simply the 2018 obligations from the agreement that was signed back in 2015. So that was the lion's share of the increase. 1% of the increase was attributed to one-time expenditures. That was a total of $256,000. And by the way, the collective bargaining increases were $934,000. The one-time expense budget increases were total $256,000, or 1% of the increase. So things that are identified in there, I'm not going to read them all to you, but things like one-time services of buying new, we're replacing existing rescue harnesses, refurbing an engine that is going to save us, we're spending $28,000 to refurb an engine that otherwise would have cost us $500,000 to replace. An IT software in $26,000, some volunteer training at $8,000, and there's about 15 items listed here. Ongoing expenses that were not personnel related was an increase of about $61,000, or 0.25%. And those, I call these mandates as far as ongoing. This had to do with an increase in liability insurance, hazardous material physicals, which are required by the state, and then an increase in dispatch services through our service provider, which is Norcom. And then the one ongoing expense that I would not categorize as mandated was adding the position of a fire inspector. We have 2 fire prevention personnel now. They're titled assistant fire marshals. A fire inspector is a couple of levels below that. We currently do not have any fire inspectors. But the reason that we asked for a fire inspector was the demand that we've had for fire inspection services because of all the development. And while I realize that Issaquah specifically has been under a moratorium, the services that we provide you through those services this year was an increase of 54%. Sammamish was an increase of 105% year over year. And Sammamish, although they just went into a moratorium, they're going to have 2 years of increases still. And then the activity in Issaquah, as far as what we're seeing, is not slowing down any as far as what's related to the fire service. And then there was a 5% increase in North Bend. Our fire districts really do not attribute much to the fire inspection load. But the cost of that fire inspector position was 142%, or just over 0.5% of the total increase. And then if you were following those, I realize I don't have a slide in front of you, you'll see that actually added up to more like 5.5%. We also reduced 1.5% the equipment fund. So you've got a 1.5% reduction there, which is why we had the total of 4%. Now, our budget, as we go through the process, is critiqued and questioned and goes through a vetting process over the last several months. I'm confident that we have set a sound budget. We also do a 5-year projection, and while we're in the middle of some level of negotiations with the unions right now, we have 1 year left on the contract, but we're hoping to complete some negotiations so that we can settle our budget and understand in the next couple of years where the significant increases will be. We are going to also be going to a biennial budget starting next year, so we'll go through that process for the first time, just like you are, and which will actually put all of our partners on biennial budget, which will make it much easier for us. And things like this or mid-year asks will all be aligned, and we'll hopefully be following that same philosophy. I anticipate, as far as the EFR goes, as far as personnel, we are not anticipating, and I did say this to the board during the process, we are not anticipating an uptick in needing personnel in the years to come. We are experiencing about a 10% increase in call volume for this year, which is significant. But as far as how we are structuring our response policies, we are simultaneously going through a review of how we respond to calls. And as we shift our methods of responding to calls, how we shift handling that workload, we are going to be able to take up whatever increase is for the foreseeable future and hopefully structure through this. And we understand one of my primary directives is from the board is to contain costs and being as efficient as possible, and we'll continue to do that. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions you have or go into any further details you'd like to.
Paul, did you have a question?
Yeah, just make sure I heard you correctly. Mm-hmm. You said you're realizing a 10% increase in service calls,
That's correct.
but you're not anticipating needing any additional personnel.
That's correct, sir.
Yeah, I heard you correctly, Dan.
Yes, and as I know I've got a meeting with Mr. Harrison later in the week, or next week, I guess. It feels like one week running together here. But no, it has to do with service delivery, the models that we utilize. And it hopefully, by the end of the year, if we can present it to the body as a whole, it should be crystal clear as how we're going to do that.
I do appreciate that. Learning more about it would be interesting. That's pretty eye-catching report. Something's going on, and it sounds good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Tola?
2 questions. Radio replacement is really expensive, right? I think for King County wide, the replacement from the current Motorola system, I believe, is something on the order of $500 million. I'm clearly in the wrong business. I should be a Motorola rep. So how is that hitting us? Is that all hitting us in sort of one big fell swoop, or?
Yeah, so our radio replacements, we are tied to, I may get some of my acronyms screwed up here, but we are tied to the PCERN changeout that's going on. We are hoping for all of our radios and planning for all of our radios to be replaced regionally as the system is converted. Where we are running up against the wall a little bit is that project keeps getting delayed before we switch over to the new 800 system. Right now, my understanding is our radios, we're going to stretch them and try to make them work to the 1920, which is when we're hoping to, but we're hearing that now the project may get delayed until it could be as late as 2022. And if I have my years and my numbers right, we might have to figure out a stopgap measure on how to purchase the radios earlier, even though they're due to us somehow through the arrangement. But as we get closer, we're going to have to watch for that. Right now, we have a radio stock that we're stretching, and we steal parts from each of the radios to keep them moving. We're comfortable we can get to that 1920 window, but if we have to push to the 2022 window, and obviously we're politicking really hard not to have to wait that long, then we could have some issues. But as of right now, it's all handled in a different levy system for the replacement of the radio system.
Okay. And the second, sorry, I had a second part.
Go ahead.
Were there any recommendations out of last year and this year's Cascadia Rising activities that impact our emergency management, our emergency response, that'll be coming down the road as we go to implement those?
Yeah, there certainly were a lot of recommendations that will impact. I think the biggest impact for an agency like EFR is how do we coordinate and supplement and support the emergency management efforts, in this case, that your city has. Of course, emergency management is the lead. Your city is the lead. We're going to support, but we're also your fire service provider. So it's how do we recall our resources, and how do we plug in and support and train, which right now, in fact, of all of our partners, I appreciate the co-training that we've done with Issaquah. You have a very robust training system, and what we take with Cascadia and how we plug into each other will determine how we're going to be successful during that. But communications is part of that. One of the things that EFR brings to the table in the communication realm is we have a strong volunteer corps. Gentleman by the name of John Bromberg was our lead fire corps volunteer. He runs a set of radio or ham operators, and we have what we call COM 80, which is a mobile communication unit that is highly equipped and very capable of taking care of communications in the east side area. And on top of that, east side and partner agencies had the wisdom a couple of years ago when we transferred to an 800 radio system to continue to maintain the VHF system in our area. We're the only ones that have done that in King County, but because we've maintained that VHF system and because of the capabilities of COM 80, we have a redundant radio system that much of the other areas do not have. Wow. So as long as we can keep that healthy and hopefully broaden and get more partners to add on to that, then we're going to be in a much better position if something like the event that Cascadia Rising measured was out there. During that event, what we were able to do was confirm that we can communicate from that vehicle to every one of our stations. And when you think about where our stations are, May Valley, all the way to Carnation, to North Bend, all the way to northern Sammamish, and then of course everywhere in Issaquah, we will be able to have some form of redundant communications because of that capability.
Very, very good to know. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any more questions for Chief Clerk? Jeff, thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Next up, presentation on emergency management. Brett Heath.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you tonight. So, got a couple of items, just a few small things here to talk about with emergency management. We're looking at an additional .25 FTE in our emergency management coordinator position. We are looking at some radio replacements and just talk briefly about EMPG grant opportunities. So for the emergency management coordinator position, currently we have we run a CERT program in coordination with Issaquah Community. The Issaquah Citizen Corps, and we offer 2 classes a year. We've trained over 600 volunteers so far, 600 citizens, and a good portion of those CERT volunteers also become registered volunteers with the City of Issaquah. So we've got a fairly good group of people that are engaged with emergency management and provide a lot of extra support and services. Along with that goes managing those volunteers and making sure that they have relevant training, they stay up to speed, and they stay engaged with the community. So part of this additional FTE is to help continue to work with those volunteers and to continue to build that program out. We also do Map Your Neighborhood, which we do as a follow-on to CERT training. Map Your Neighborhood is sort of an entry-level, if you will, introduction to emergency management and get to know your neighbors, find out who has what capabilities. So we have trained a number of neighborhoods through Map Your Neighborhood. We also do work with the Medical Reserve Corps, with Issaquah volunteers, and we work with King County on their Medical Reserve Corps. So there's a number of volunteer programs that we are involved with in emergency management. And again, this increase is to help support that. We also, as Chief Clark mentioned, do quite a bit of training. That's an important piece of being prepared, and we want to be able to continue that as well as work with our other plans, doing our emergency management plans, keeping those up to date and developing, staying current. So this additional FTE will help us do that. It also helps, we're currently with a .75 FTE, 3/4 time person, so this should help with retaining that position as well, and provide some continuity there for us. So that's the additional position. We have...
Brett, I'm going to just stop for a second.
Sure.
We tend to have questions on positions. Any questions on adding the additional staffing quarter position or not? Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, all right.
Oh, hang on. Nope, one
So
question.
that is taking a half-time to a 3/4 time, you said?
Taking a 3/4 time to a full time.
Okay, so a person in place just extending the
Correct.
hours of service.
Correct, yes. Okay. All right, next item, we have a number of radios that we've distributed. Typically, we've been using hand-me-down radios, VHF system, to communicate during emergencies, disasters amongst city departments and city buildings and locations. Those radios are now 20-some plus years old and are not operating in there as reliably as they should be. So this is just a replacement of those older radios. Under the radio replacement one item. I don't know if there are any questions on that. Okay, these are not 800 megahertz, these are VHF. And the last one is just the EMPG grant. Issaquah, again, qualifies for around $19,000 in emergency management planning grant. This year, in 2017, we used that grant for training for the incident management team that Issaquah runs, and very successful training. Next year, we're looking at using that grant for equipment for the incident management team. So that's my presentation.
Brett. Any questions for Brett? Brett, yes, we have one.
So
Go.
just, these positions, I believe, are under your department, correct? And emergency management stuff, and
Correct. Yes.
that's where I'd see them. Okay, thank you, since we're doing it by protocol, not by.
Yes.
Thank you.
Brad, I just wanted to make one comment about the volunteer programs that you have, and that in terms of community safety, it really is, that is just the absolute perfect model of where your piece of it complements the community stepping up as well and participating in these programs and building out this core. One of the statistics I heard recently was that we have one of the highest percentage of CERT-trained residents in our town compared to our population. to adjacent jurisdictions. So you must be running a really solid program, and the best way to respond in an emergency is to have such a broad community-based resource. So thank you for all your work on that. It's great.
Thank you.
There's no questions for Brett. The last one this evening under community safety is ADA improvements.
Thank you.
Sheldon Lynn.
Thank you. Yes. Oh. Uh-oh. Where'd the song go?
Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe no Sheldon Lynn tonight.
There we go. Went too far. So I'm going to talk about ADA ramps and relationship to the PMP program. When the streets are overlaid in town, the ADA ramps, as the overlays occur in crosswalks and through intersections, the ADA ramps are required by law to be upgraded and made compliant. In 2014, the city did an ADA transition plan, and to give you an order of magnitude here, the ADA backlog in dollars in 2014 dollars in the right-of-way is over $22 million, and that's 2014 dollars. So you'd have to escalate that to current times to give you a more current dollar value. The map up here shows streets that are planned on the overlay program. And what has occurred in the past is that the PMP has actually used about 15% of its money each year just bringing ADA facilities compliant as they go through the crosswalks and intersections. The money is specifically made, though, to keep your streets in good condition, the asphalt. And so as the PMP starts to do work in the more dense areas where the blocks are shorter and things like that, there's an increase in ADA ramps, coincidental with number of intersections, driveways, things like that. And so the number of ramps has just about doubled from last year to this year. And so the program itself can't support continuing to do the ADA ramps and also maintain your streets with the asphalt and so forth to try and keep the pavement index as adopted by the city. So given the limited amount of funding, we've looked to the programmatic funds of the Complete Streets line item, what has historically been called Complete Streets, to design and construct the ADA required facilities to bring them compliant and help the PMP program out. As a result, the majority of those funds next year in that program are going to be slated for ADA improvements. Historically, the ADA, not the ADA, but the Complete Streets has been used for sidewalk and multimodal types of improvements that are relatively small, and then also ADA improvements that are being done there. By repurposing the Complete Streets money to primarily the ADA improvements, it doesn't change the city's policies or philosophy of building streets as complete streets. We still are going to design streets and build them and permit them with the elements of complete streets in accordance with the City Council's policies and directions that have been given. So with that, I don't have any more.
Questions? Questions for Sheldon? Paul?
Sheldon, we do ADA ramps independent of pavement overlays.
As well, yes.
Could you just give, so I've just noticed some around town and they're not associated with that. So how do we, I am wondering, well, I haven't looked for it in the budget. If there's, so you're saying the Complete Street dollars in 2018 are really are all going toward ADA ramps in conjunction with the pavement management program?
A majority of them are, not all of them. The other elements in the Complete Streets funding in the budget are going to go towards updating the crossing guidelines for pedestrian crossings, get a little bit more direction and policy direction on when you start to implement certain elements within crossings. And then also it's going to update the traffic calming program. And then there's a little bit left over for implementing some traffic calming if needed next year. And so that's, and then ADA improvements.
Okay, so ADA, okay, will be beyond.
ADA is
just
going to be the
PMP. It's
majority,
still gonna
yes.
be-
There's
it's still gonna be a
no
majority
other
of
real
complete streets.
construction out of it.
So, I got a couple questions. Anybody else? So I'm kind of surprised that we'd use Complete Streets monies to update manuals or procedures. If there wasn't another pot of money to pull from instead of a project, what has typically in the past been used for projects, is there another pot of money to pull from to do that kind of work?
We don't have another pot of money to pull from for that. It's related specifically to that Complete Streets. For instance, we've been doing a lot of crossing upgrades and things like that with the Complete Streets money, and it's important to update those guidelines so that, in future years when Complete Streets or other projects are done, we'll be able to do that. And so we felt it was an appropriate use to update those guidelines and things.
I want to add to that. We've been having a lengthy conversation with CIC, Council's Infrastructure Committee, about the policy of Complete Streets and then the program that we've slapped a label on that's called Complete Streets. And that program has been used for a diverse array of kinds of projects and even professional services in the past. So that's past practice. So it's not inconsistent, and yet we're moving away from using that programmatic label of Complete Streets. Because as Sheldon described, whenever we do streets, we do Complete Streets. So there's not some separate program for Complete Streets. That's the Issaquah way, is to design and construct complete streets. So we're in the middle of, I think, making that transformation. And all that we're saying is the bucket of funds that used to be called Complete Streets are going to be used in this way, as we've described tonight, next year. But going forward, it probably doesn't make sense to have a program called Complete Streets. We have line items that need to be funded, and we may need to get back to just funding those as discrete line items, like we have a pavement management program, we have sidewalk repair, we have ADA ramps, for example, and we may need to just call those out so that we have the annual allotment that we need each year to take care of those facilities, and still the funds available to do the professional services work that we need to as well.
Okay, so a couple more questions along the same line. The Complete Streets program, to me, when I first came on council, I think, if I remember Councilmember Scher's critiques, were that it was a way to add money to capital projects, to add in things like bike lanes and sidewalks. My understanding of what Complete Streets was supposed to be was a program that helped with gaps, where we have older infrastructure and we have incomplete sidewalk connections, and that this money might be used for those smaller projects with gaps. So one is, I thought it had to deal with our older inventory and in trying to ensure that we could, where possible, do low-cost connections.
Yeah, I meant to also address that. We've made changes in our capital program, too, that I think warrant this change in what we're calling Complete Streets program. So we have a different threshold for capital projects now. We're making a more deliberate effort to try to make sure that we have capital projects, even if they're annual capital projects, like sidewalk gap filling, right? Would be a capital program that we might have, that we would put an amount of money in each year's capital budget in order to fill in those gaps. Or we're taking the types of projects that were smaller, and we're now saying those need to be in the capital program. Why are they separated from the capital program? So we're still getting that work done. We're just not putting it under this label. There was difficulty interpreting what would be a capital, or a Complete Streets eligible project versus a capital project. We're just trying to make that cleaner by putting things in the capital program and then identifying more clearly these ongoing, every year kind of maintenance and reinvestment and regulatory requirements.
That makes a lot of sense. Just two little follow-ups then. One is are we complete on all of the intersection crosswalk improvements that were in the crosswalk study? Is that program complete? And have we got any of that work in 2018?
Currently, what we're under construction on right now should complete those. We've done a couple of studies, as Emily has referred to, that are going to probably generate their own capital project out of that crossing study, and those we're still developing.
Okay, and then the last question was, last year there was a new reserve fund set up, and I think there's over $750,000 now in it, and it was related to revenue over expenditures for red light cameras. And it doesn't look like in this current budget in 2018, we're actually planning on allocating any of that for capital projects to improve crosswalk safety. And I'm wondering why not? And you don't have to answer it tonight if you just want to take it away as a question. Fair enough.
Well, that's great. We'll make a note of it. We'll get you an answer because we have one. Good.
Mariah.
So the complete overview of the regulation changes with ADA, that whole report was back in 2014, correct? And so there were probably many elements to it, not just ADA ramps. So I was just hoping to get an update on where we're at, and is this the last part of that, and will then the ramp portion be completely done in 2018? So several different questions. And
Sure. Sure, I'll take your last question first. The answer is no, it won't all be complete.
Okay.
The ADA transition plan provides an inventory and assessment of all of our facilities, and it goes through and identifies where they're compliant, where they're not, makes recommendations on how to bring them up to that standard. And then federal law says you have to have a plan. We have a capital plan. We have the transition plan. As long as we can continue to demonstrate progress, be deliberate about that, then we should be in compliance. So here you see an element where we're trying to bring things up to standard. Likewise, every time we have a facility improvement, a renovation in a building, for example, where the structure is not ADA compliant in some regard, that is incorporated then into that renovation design and construction plan. So as opportunities arise to reinvest and reconstruct, then we are bringing those facilities up to the standard.
And so I guess my question, and I wasn't specific, was more about what needs to be done on the streets outside, as opposed to facilities that were obviously going forward and then have an opportunity to make those ADA compliant.
Sure.
But so this is just one element of what we would be doing outside.
Sure, we can share the transition plan with you if you're interested. Sheldon gave the example of $22 million worth of ADA ramps. We've been chipping away at that with each of our pavement management program years, and with every kind of new street design that we do. So we're making progress on that, but that's one example of on-road facilities. I think adaptive signals is another.
Audible PED signals.
Yeah, audible PED signals is another example of improvements that we make when we upgrade signals.
Okay.
But I'd be happy to share the plan with you.
Okay, so I'm just, the 2018 Complete Streets funding is going to take care of a portion.
Correct, a
of
portion.
What we're trying to do with ADA ramps.
Correct.
Okay.
Bill?
And just want to clarify names for 2018, because I've heard a bunch of going around, and maybe for me and maybe for the audience as well. So we have our pavement management program, it's going to have X dollars in it. And this, in 18, those dollars are going to go 100% for pavement.
That is correct.
All right. Then, as part of that, we have to do some other upgrades along with them whenever we do something. And any upgrades required outside of the pavement itself will be covered by a line that says complete streets still in 2018. Is that line still say complete streets?
Sure. I believe it's still found on the Complete Streets budget page, and this is a line item.
Okay, so
one of the
currently-
activities that's
So
funded.
I know we're trying to get rid of that name, but in 18...
Correct. We're not there quite yet.
In 19,
Yeah.
it'll be gone. 18, it's still there.
Correct.
And then in 18, we're going to be looking for items such as other sidewalk stuff that has typically been done under that before, such as new repair, replace sidewalks that needed, that we've looked at, and we started to build a system on how to select those and criteria to evaluate them. So is that shown as a line for sidewalks under this year's budget, or how are we, because we still want to continue that program, because we're still missing a number of sidewalks and some need repair. Right?
We have maintenance money, so repair money is found in the Public Works operations budget to some degree. Did you wind up with any
I
at the end of the
didn't.
day in PWE?
not.
So it's all in PWO. And we also have capital projects that involve either sidewalk reconstruction or filling in gaps. However, you heard me say that we are also looking into the future and talking about how do we develop a capital program that will have some annual funding for sidewalk replacement. And
So-
Jen is telling me, look at TR 011, which is a capital project number, but do we know
Okay.
this? What's the short description on that for?
That one, that is, my microphone doesn't work, but I can certainly talk loud enough. That is a project that is identified as complete streets, but as you've heard
Okay.
tonight, that in the future would be changing.
Right. So what I'm looking for is, as in last year, we went and did a process to pick which ones of those sidewalks, and we had to pick, are we going to do that this year to say where are our most critical pieces? You know, if we've got sidewalks that are jagged and very unsafe for people, you know, versus finding those places that we don't have them and people want
Right.
them, how are we going to prioritize those smaller ones?
Right,
this year?
so we're not anticipating doing that kind of work this year with the council. We have the operating repair money, where Public Works Operations looks at what are problem areas, where have we had trips and falls or complaints, what's below, you know, our minimum threshold for then requiring repair. Those are the things that they will prioritize for their operating budget. For filling in gaps, we are needing to develop a project, a standalone project that will become the fill-in gap on sidewalk project. That's more complicated, as we've talked about with CIC, because you can't just do sidewalks. And so by and large, where you are seeing us fill in gaps, it's tied with some other road related project. So there will be no picking and choosing of which sidewalk gaps to fill in because of that complexity. We usually try to append it to a road project.
Okay, so sidewalks this year won't be a discussion with the council. You'll do whatever you can under
Well-
operations,
well,
and you'll
we've-
make those selections?
We've talked about it wherever we've talked about capital projects. When we went through the capital projects plan review, there were projects in there that involve sidewalks as well. But like I said, we don't have a capital project right now about just filling in gaps. So therefore, there won't be a need to talk about where are we doing that. It's not in the capital plan for next year.
At this time, okay?
Okay, that's a
Thank you.
good question. Any other questions on this? Okay, I had a couple. Sheldon, you made a quick reference to adding some dollars for traffic calming. So I had two parts to it. One is last year there was an allocation of $100,000 specifically targeted somewhere in the downtown area and community meetings have happened, but actually not far enough along that any of those dollars, I think, were expended. Will they move forward to 2018 in the event that the downtown neighborhood ends up at a place with the city where they end up getting some sort of constructed traffic calming?
We'll be able to move them forward if they aren't expended this
Okay.
year, because right now they're anticipated to be spent, But if they're not, they'll end up in the ending fund, and so we should be able to request for a budget amendment to move them forward.
And then the second piece was when you said some small amount, are we talking about $100,000 additionally added in 2018, or what is some small amount?
No, it wasn't added. It's just a component within the 562 that's in the budget for complete streets, and it's probably about 15,000, somewhere around there. It's not a lot. If there's any substantive type of traffic calming that we really need to implement, we'll have to come back to council for budget authority.
So we're in discussions right now with the Highlands neighborhood about, I think it's 24th and 25th, the same sort of process. And actually, it started before, I think their community meeting was even before downtown. So why wouldn't we be also putting in $100,000 in the event that those discussions might end up in some sort of improvement?
Because we're not certain that it's going to require physical devices. The community education and outreach is the first step in working through these types of issues in accordance with the program. And then as time goes by, we'll see how well that works. And then as the program identifies phase 2, you start to look at the more physical improvements and things like that. Issaquah Highlands already has a substantive amount of traffic calming already built into it with the narrow streets, parking on both sides, and things like that. So we have to be careful about how much more we implement to make sure that it'll be effective if it gets implemented and doesn't create other issues. But there's a process to go through.
Just add that right now what we're looking at is more capital outlay expenditure, not to the capital project threshold amount. In the Highlands, we've had several conversations. We had the neighborhood meeting, and then we've had several conversations with Issaquah Highlands Community Association and Issaquah Highlands Council, and we've arrived at some shared process for owning the next steps and contributions to those next steps. And as Sheldon stated, there's a desire, because it is a closed neighborhood. There's only one way into the top and one way out. So it's neighbors that by and large are needing to calm their traffic, right? And so we think a little education, some capital outlay that may be spent on campaigns, signage, some minor improvements to improve visibility, safety at intersections. We have a host of short and mid-range timeline and cost items that we think we can get done without a major capital project or expenditure. But that's still a work in progress. We're still evaluating that. We do want to test and see how well that works. And then ultimately, as Sheldon said, if we determine that we need to come back and ask for a more significant dollar amount, we will do that.
Okay, and I bring it up because in that community, there's still significant talk. The information that was shared with them showed that there is speeding occurring. And so to date, and I think the original complaint came in 11 months ago or 12 months ago, they're still experiencing speeding. And so there is a sense of urgency within the community, and I want to make sure that we are not putting money in the budget isn't going to hurt dealing with the problem, which is to eliminate speeding. And then the second piece is on private property, when a commercial property owner recognizes that his employees or his clients are speeding, they also go through a process of education. But many of the parking lots in our area do have physical speed devices or constructed. They have constructed an environment to get the end result, which is to reduce the speeding. And so that's great that they do that. The community themselves is relying on us, on our streets to do it. So I want to be really sure that we're going to actually reduce speeding in that neighborhood. And if it means adding funds, I think we ought to do that, but that's a discussion the council can have at a later time.
Right, and that's one we would like to have at that time. We want to get some, we want to work through phase 1 and then get some consensus on what's the appropriate way to do anything that would be a physical deterrent to speeding. The way the Highlands is designed, if you put traffic calming elements on one street, you may just push the problem to another street, and so on and so on. And it's not feasible nor appropriate, I think. And I'm sure police, fire chief especially would say not appropriate to put devices that are going to affect their response time. And so we just want to be very thoughtful about physical devices on the roadway. But there are some things that we can do to still try to get that behavior, short of putting speed humps like a private property owner might do in a parking lot. The situation is quite different when you have more of a grid system.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, that's why I brought it up with the fire chief last year and kind of went through the whole discussion. And in Highlands, it's tricky. You could have parked cars on both sides and all the rest of it. But he did assure me that there are ways that they can work with speed bumps and all the rest of it. So I just want to make sure that it's a big concern up there. Any more questions for Sheldon? That is, I actually want to get the council's opinion on this too. I liked having the approach that you took tonight where you presented an entire topic. I do have a few more questions. I think they're mostly for Scott, but I think it might be helpful if you had any suggestions or comments on this approach that they're taking, whether or not you like this and you're getting the information you need. It would be good for them to hear it tonight. Also, I have a few more questions that I realized I'd written down that I would like to ask Scott. So if you have more questions, we can also get them on the record this evening. Hola.
So I'll just ask, I want to make sure that I thought I heard correct. We are going to have later in the budget process this conversation about the 5-year trend line and what's going on with deficits and all that. There'll be a meaty conversation about that.
Yes, I believe that it will be the work session number 3. That would be under the financial sustainability topic. And so there's a variety of items that are listed about new revenue sources. We'll talk about the debt funding. That's where we talked about at Services and Safety last night about a broader conversation of that. And then we will add that topic specifically about the financial model and how we look at longer term the decisions we make now on our financials versus waiting until the future.
Okay. One piece of that is I would love to be able to see at a departmental level where it's outpacing inflation. So again, that cost per capita in real dollars going forward, it'd be worth understanding, which isn't necessarily to call out. It may be that that department has historically been underfunded or, it's just in a place where it needs to play catch up. But when we go to have that conversation, I would love to know, a level down from citywide where we're exceeding inflation at a per capita. Thanks.
Actually, Scott, can I get you to come back up for a few more safety-specific questions? And we'll do a round of general questions as well. You had talked recently about a crime dashboard that we should be seeing on the city's website, and I wanted to know if there were costs associated with that are in the 2018 budget.
No.
No. Okay, and then Council has been talking about wanting to explore parking code enforcement, and I'm wondering if there's any proposal or funding in the 2018 budget that deals with enforcement.
No.
Okay. I think that is the last of my safety and security questions. Any general questions that, Bill, go ahead. Thank you,
Not
Scott.
specifically for you, but I heard stated, mainly from you, Jen, that you were trying to spread the true cost of doing business to the departments, particularly from like IT and human resources. So those departments were paying that direct cost, which sounds perfect to me. But my follow to that was, if that's true, then the cost for those departments should be dwindling significantly, almost to the point of disappearing, if all the departments are paying their fair share of those departments, right? So if those two departments are to serve the rest of the city and everybody's paying their fair share, then that department would almost have a zero cost to it. So or getting down significantly. So I'm just asking that question, how does that work? Because it looks like those departments still have their regular cost to them.
Those when you're looking at an internal service fund, you're looking at, yes, that there is a revenue that comes in to match the current expenditures that go on an ongoing basis. So in those funds, you still have staffing, you have the operating costs, you have some capital outlay as well. And the reason for those funds, yes, that you would expect that would always be at zero, and that's the intention. However, those funds also collect dollars for replacement. So that's that, in the private sector, you have depreciation as an expense, and so you're building that in, and so you're creating your rates in order to cover future replacement costs. So that's also built into the charge that, for example, you'll see in that fund that the fund charges the general fund and all of the different departments. And so you're going to see more revenues over expenditures because there's a need to build up reserves so that over time that there's not such big peaks and valleys in replacing equipment and replacing infrastructure for IT. So that's part of it. So it doesn't always come net to zero because of the replacement component in an internal service fund.
That answer your question, Bill? Sort of, for now. Any other questions?
You have a question?
Paul?
Working with the budget document, I'd like to talk about how to use that to really understand what we're doing for capital. So you have a section in there, capital project funds. And in its opening page, you just show the same one you showed in the slide earlier. It's the 5-year. You have a comment in there that potential funding sources and timelines are available in the CIP document. You have a link over to that. And then beneath that, you have for each fund, the 305, like municipal facilities, street capital project funds, parks, all of those. When I look at, I'll use the street capital for an example. There is an expenditure line down there of capital project. And we see budgeted for 17, amended, and then looks like the actuals. And then there's a 18 proposed budget. So and it's just $1, and I don't see anywhere else in this budget, in this document, what's the details behind that? So I'm assuming you're saying, go look at the CIP.
Exactly.
Now, the numbers don't match.
Good question.
So I looked at the table above and streets below, and the numbers don't match. So how are we supposed to know what it is we're planning on doing?
That's a very good question. One of the things in the financial management policy under the capital budget section was we wanted to specifically highlight the art funding from capital projects. And so the numbers wouldn't 100% match up if we just took, because the good example is transportation, so you would say, okay, $28 million that have been identified for 2018, you can see that same number out of the streets capital project fund because that's where the funding happens. What's new this year that we specifically daylighted, and that's in the detail in those individual projects, is that calculation so that you'll see in the street capital fund is a transfer out to the municipal art fund. And so what we wanted to do is separate that so that those art projects were in the art fund. So you wouldn't see the exact same amount align up because we wanted to ensure that the art fund was getting what the council intended per policy to cover those projects for art.
Okay, so let's carry that forward a little bit further. Mm-hmm. I take the number that's in the table in the CIP for transportation, 2018, 19.5 million in the budget here. It just says, the expenditure line is 17.3 million. Mm-hmm. Be surprised if 2.5 of that is art. But also we know that we're going to underspend our budget by $13 million in our 2017 budget. So clearly, there's some at least some capital related to transportation was appropriated for 2017 is going to be respent. So how should I look at that? We're not budgeting for that reappropriation, but we probably will see a reappropriation.
That's correct.
So how are we? Okay.
So you've mentioned a couple of things. In the 2017, and in the upcoming budget amendment that the council will be considering, that's where we are updating the budget because we need more spending authorization for one project, but we need less for another project. So you have a net budget amendment, and so that's influencing the forecast for the end of 2017. In 2018, additionally in that budget number is reauthorization dollars for specific projects. And so if it would help that we could bring you back an accounting of what's reauthorization, what's the municipal art fund transfer out, so that you could clearly tie those numbers out, because those are all influencing that summary line item. But the intention was, yes, to shift you to that capital budget where all the details are project specific, and in the operating budget, essentially that action is to fund those projects, and the devil's in the details in the CIP.
Okay, so if the 17.3 also includes anticipated reauthorizations, and the actual map back to the CIP for 2018 is even different still, because again, we have, what did I say, 19.5 in the plan for 2018. So how are we supposed to know of the CIP projects? And I realize some of it's for art as well. How are we supposed to know what the plan is?
There is, and in tonight's summary presentation, I had a list of projects individually.
Okay.
So what we'll do is we'll ensure that you get that in a readable form, because right now it's in slide presentation. But the intention tonight was to provide in the slide deck, the list of those projects, so you could start to see what projects are included in 2018. Those will tie back to the capital budget. There's one nuance that I can specifically point out, is that there are funds for the ITS. That is a specific project in the capital budget. That is not tracked and hasn't been because there were bonds issued. And so you'll see in the capital projects section, that fund is essentially, we're going to finish that project, use up those dollars. And so the total transportation projects include $176,000, but we've got essentially two funds that would be considered street capital project funds. So there's the budgets are necessarily complex, for sure. So it's those things that are not clear will provide maybe a better accounting path for you to see the capital budget that was adopted, and then the funding of that. What fund does that actually get tracked out of and expensed?
Okay, so let me see if I understood. The slide that you showed us that was in today's packet, that list of projects is certainly not a superset. It may actually be a subset of what's in the CIP for 2018.
No, that is all of the projects.
That's the complete set?
Yes, the total cost of the project. So
for that year. I mean, but I mean, in terms of lists of projects, so there's a roll-up for those in transportation.
That is a list of specific projects.
Right, okay, and so those are all the ones that were in the original capital plan?
Yes, in 2018. That is a list of the transportation, or all projects. Yeah, and you'll see that there's some categorization of the type of asset.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the gap in my mind just grew in this. So I guess my question, I'm trying to get to a question for you to be able to answer for us. So I can look at the CIP, I see a number. I do know that some of that is art. Again, I'm just talking about the example of transportation. I know some of that is art. I know that number in there is less than what's in the expenditure budget here, but you also told me the expenditure budget includes some anticipated reauthorizations. And you also just said some of the spend in there is actually bond money. Did you, is that actually with, not for the ITS? Did you mean to say that that's showing up in the street fund? No.
No, the ITS-related project
Yeah.
has its own capital project
All right.
fund.
All right, so yeah, so the mapping, I like it, you use the word, the accounting of it. That would be, I'm going to try to figure out how to ask that question. We have a list of projects, but I can't tie out the numbers that they equate to in the CIP with the expenditure line item that's here in the budget document. So I need help tying those out.
I think what I'm hearing you ask for is more of a line item in the capital project funds so that you can tie those individual projects back to the CIP.
Yeah, I actually refrained from asking that because I noticed that how that was different, right? And I knew what you were trying to do. So if a line item is the way to answer that, again, I'll pose it this way. It's like, help me tie out the number in our 2018 CIP with the numbers we're actually seeing in the overall budget, because this is the one we're going to approve.
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Thank
Yes,
you.
we can do that.
Jen, I have a question on that as well. I like the structure of the new budget book. I think it's great. Last year, there were some extra tables in there, and I don't actually want to put them back in, but I'll tell you what I did with them and see if there is something you can think that may be able to help us map this back. Last year, I went to each of the tables and took out whatever the road projects were, because the mayor's priorities in last year's were to transportation's number one. He pulled them all out, and I created my own spreadsheet that talked about each project and how much we were spending and where we were spending it from and whether or not it was the full project or a partial project, so that in my mind I could paint a picture or talk to a resident and say, here's our plan for next year, here's what you're going to see on the ground. And so I'm wondering if there isn't a table or a figure, it could be part of our appendices or backup material here that does that again. And that was how we actually pieced together that we had been spending a certain amount on complete streets, but we didn't spend it for 1 year, and we had decided, after seeing it that way, to add it in at double the amount to make sure that we weren't losing ground on working on complete streets. So I'm wondering if there is a way to do that, and maybe those numbers then would help inform the question that Paul had. I'm not sure. But for me, it gives me, I then now know what I can go out and tell people they should be expecting to see in stuff. So I'm not exactly sure what that looks like, but I could help you with that if that.
I think the combination of a more detailed capital project budget information for you, along with the list that was provided tonight, will help to answer some of those questions and give you that map so that you can say, this is a project in the capital budget, this is the portion that we're going to do in 2018, but also then connect then that if in the case of a project that is multi-year, that either it's starting or finishing or in the middle of it.
I think what that allows me then to do is to look at the whole budget, and if transportation's a priority and I can pull that piece out, I can see the resources we're putting and what they're being spent on, and I can feel a great degree of comfort that it is prioritized based on that. So that would be very helpful. Right.
Just a basic ask. So if we're going to be focused on the presentation like we had this evening by topic, could we have, like at the beginning, the first slide, talk about, or with what we're looking at before we come in, the page numbers that correspond to the overall proposed budget, and then any links that would be helpful for us, just to make it more efficient and be my ask.
Anybody else have any general questions that they want to give to Jen for her list, or talk about format of the budget or additional requests on presentations? Great. So Jen, you have everything you need from us?
I think we do. I just want to make sure, Christina, do you need any clarification on questions? Emily, Bob? I think we've got them captured.
Fantastic. Would you give us a very quick little brief introduction or tell us what we're talking about in our next work session for those that are watching?
Yes, let me pull that up if you just bear with me one moment. All right. The next budget work session is October 30th. I'm going to pull up the topics here to tee up. This will be the second budget review. Starts at 6:30 here in this building. The department presentations on budget parameters are going to include technology improvements for lean principle implementation. Some of the more detailed topics will be we'll do a more in-depth review of the internal service fund for IT. We'll talk about the status of the Munis ERP. We'll talk about some new applications, the Park and Rec software, the business process improvements updates for you to hear what has been going on with regards to our lean implementation. Then we're going to talk about service levels and maintaining those existing ones with quality over quantity as an overarching guide. And so you're going to hear from our Parks Director and myself about our departmental restructures for that. We'll talk about the senior center programs, the recreation facility programs, some of the proposed new. And then we're going to be talking about the turf replacement program. And so we've heard some questions about that. So that's where you're going to see some of the detail to help answer those questions that we have already gotten from council members. And then we'll be talking about our efforts regarding transportation. We'll also be talking about post-moratorium and a project status update and plans for implementation in 2018. And we'll be talking about special projects, specifically about mobility master planning, the Old Town parking, sign code, and then just like tonight, we'll be receiving any council questions so that we can prepare detail. That's what we have for next time.
And we've scheduled an hour, right?
We have scheduled that to happen in half an hour. Just kidding, 3 hours. Yeah.
Thanks, Jen. And also thanks for your time today. You and I walked through some of the questions that I had. I still owe you some more, which I will get to shortly. And I would encourage all council members to give their questions in as soon as possible because it really does allow staff the time to research them and also to put together those questions that are similar instead of having us duplicate their effort. I guess that's it for this evening.
One more question.
Oh, sure. One more question.
Since you brought up the schedule, what would be the appropriate time to address LTAC? Because I have that committee working to prepare actually by the 30th, but if that, just because I didn't know, if indeed maybe that's going to be at a different meeting, then I can make an adjustment. So if you want to get back to me on that, that's fine. Okay. Thank you.
Any more questions? Then we are adjourned, and I want everybody to make sure that Stacy knows that we adjourned 35 minutes early. Saying.